Our next speaker in this series is Emeritus Professor Jane Kelsey, pūkenga of ngā Toki Whakarururanga. Jane is talking this morning on, looking for my glasses, on current free trade agreements and threat to sovereignty o rangatiratanga. So Jane is an academic activist who has spent an absolute lifetime teaching and researching law from critical and te tiriti-based perspectives at Waipapa Taumatarau, Auckland University. She provides analysis and training on neoliberal globalisation for activists in Aotearoa and internationally, and advises developing country governments as well. She's pūkenga for ngā Toki Whakarururanga, provides technical advice on the interface of free trade and investment agreements around the treaty. I don't know if Jane ever sleeps, because I wake up in the morning sometimes on my emails and it's like there's a thesis and a critique of, the latest free trade agreement that's come through, and it's all been deciphered for us so we don't have to do that work ourselves. I couldn't do that work ourselves, so this is why there's room for every one of us with all of our superpowers in this movement, and it's with such pleasure that I introduce Jane Kelsey.
Kia ora koutou, he mahana kia koutou, ki ngā tangata whenua o tēnei marae, tēnei rohe, tēnā koutou, e ngāui o ngā hoi whā, me ngā iwi take, tēnā koutou. And to Vandana Shiva, you probably don't remember me, but we did spend a number of WTO ministerials and other things together on the outside. It's great to have you here with us. I don't usually like speaking at hui, but I was told I had to actually explain to people what free trade agreements are. So I'll try and make it as exciting as possible. So some of it's really simple, right? Think of the most powerful corporations in the world. Think of them saying, how can we make global rules that do everything we want and make governments take away all the rules we don't want? And that's basically the guts of the international free trade agreements. Some of those really powerful corporations were, of course, back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, those like Monsanto and Cargill and then Syngenta. And they weren't just interested in old-fashioned trade, where you would send a commodity across the border. They were interested in controlling the knowledge and the technologies and the whole ecosystem for production of what we would call food. And that included areas like intellectual property, controlling the rights over the seeds, stealing the seeds, and then claiming the rights over the seeds. Insisting that whatever they produced as a result could not be excluded from other countries unless there was scientific proof and evidence on a Western model of what the risks and harms would be. And they decided that the best place to do this was through these things called trade agreements. So those who we have heard referred to as the Western capitalist colonial patriarchy set out about implanting these rules in global trade agreements. And why did they choose trade agreements? Well, a number of reasons. The first is that they're incredibly boring and no one wants to know about them. The second is that they are concerned about the interests of commercial players. They give primacy to those and they marginalise any other concerns, even if they make it onto the agenda. The third is that the global trade rules are made by the rule-making countries, which were those, of course, of the global multinationals. And so they could rely on their allies in the old corporate state alliances to develop rules that would work best for them. It was helped by the fact that all these negotiations would take place in secret. So those who might not like them wouldn't actually get to see what was on the table and what had been cooked up and what their governments had agreed to until it was a done deal. And in many countries, including in Aotearoa, that didn't even go near the parliament. It would be dealt with by the executive, you know, that little triumvirate we have now that says it's going to make all the decisions for Aotearoa. And once you had these rules that had been designed in secret for the corporations, they could be enforced in offshore tribunals, and the penalties for breaching those could be sanctions against your other commercial interests. And so when Annette was talking before about in the early to mid-1990s there being a backlash and an attempt to stop in the Parliament the adoption of the Intellectual Property Rights Agreement in the newly established World Trade Organization, this was a bit of a shock to those who thought that they could just do whatever they wanted and no one would notice. Likewise, when the initial discussions started with Moana Jackson and Ngāna Korman-Hinnick, and then with the Mātātua Declaration, this notion that there might be busybody Indigenous peoples who might try to intervene in this process was also a shock. I remember being at a hui in Pōneke that had been called by the National Māori Congress, where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade official came along, and where Moana Jackson came along. And Moana spoke in his normal, quiet, eloquent way, and explained all of the fundamentals of mātauranga, of tikanga, of the entire cosmological relationship of Papatūānuku and Ranganui through whakapapa to the present day. And the guy from MFAT then got up and said, "Yes, but what provision in the agreement do you have a problem with?" Nothing has changed. Hey, Jessica. And so, if we're looking at how we try to understand what the Crown and what the Western capitalist patriarchy are up to, we actually have to understand how dumb they are. But they are dumb with power, which means that we can't just say they're dumb and dismiss them. We actually have to understand enough, not all the technical horrible details of the kind of things that I might send through to Jessica in the early hours of the morning, but how to link what they have been doing there to the kaupapa that you are living here. And we know when it comes to agriculture, when we're dealing in the international arena here, they are exclusively concerned with commodity mass production, increasingly agri-tech activities, which are driven by profit, but which take place on stolen land, which suck off the water, which pollute the waterways, and which is a totally unsustainable model, even if we leave the climate crisis issues to one side. But that is the model they are obsessed with advancing in every single trade agreement. That is the only thing they are obsessed with advancing. So when it comes to the kaupapa of this hui, it's not just a nuisance, it's a direct challenge and confrontation to the commercial objectives in their trade agreements. And so this has been the subject of battles over many years, and some of those have been discussed already and some will be discussed this afternoon. But I just want to highlight a couple of them to show that the Crown is not only dumb, it's a very slow learner that closes its ears. So we had in the early 80s those battles around the intellectual property rules being developed in what became the World Trade Organization, known as TRIPS, Trade-Related Agreement on Intellectual Property Rights. That informed the Y262 claim. And plants and seeds were a fundamental part of that claim. In the next phase of that claim, Te Waka Kaiora joined with others, and Donna Kerridge, I'm sure will talk about this, not in the World Trade Organization agreements, but an agreement with Australia about having a joint system of food standards between Aotearoa and Australia. And in the more recent times, similar issues around so-called therapeutic products, which includes rongoa. So having external rules developed as to what you can not just export, but what you can do in Aotearoa. Yeah. So these have been around for some time. I want to talk a little bit about some of the contemporary stuff. Who went on the TPPA marches? Hey, kia ora. It was about 25,000 in it. We have this ongoing battle where, and it's got a very vivid imagination, including who was on the security intelligence list. But people got uptight about the TPPA for a number of reasons. The first was that the US was driving it, and we all know that the US is the home of biotech and agri-tech, and that would be a fundamental part of what was being cooked up here. But the second problem, it was secret, so we couldn't actually prove that. The third thing was that there was no place, not just no place for Māori, but no place for anyone in this country to have a say because the deal was being done purely by the executive. It was Labour, no difference. Put a little slice of paper between them. And so we had a really, really important set of challenges. And I want to reinforce the message from this morning. We may not always win, but we shift the ground by those protests. And we have a government today, a Minister of Trade today, who was the minister at the time when TPPA was signed and who says, the last thing I want is to have to deal with those kinds of protests again. Huh? I'm not sure we could actually do it again either, because there's too many rabbit holders out there who would say it's about vapour trails. But the other important thing, and this is a point that Annette was making, the Y2522 Waitangi Tribunal claim on the TPPA, which was hugely frustrating and took 5 years of our lives, achieved a number of really important things. It was the only space in which the Crown could be forced to have to answer. Yeah? It is the only place where it can be forced to have to answer. That included part of the claim that was on the Plant Varieties Act. Yeah? And so we've got stalwarts here who have fought that fight forever, and the tribunal was dumb. The tribunal was scared, actually, scared and dumb. And so we had Angeline giving this magnificent evidence, we had Donna giving this magnificent evidence along a number of others. And they said, oh yes, but the principles of the treaty in the Y262 claim said that the Crown only has to consult with Māori on a sliding scale of importance of things in terms of te tiriti. And they have made an assessment that we think is actually kind of all right. Now, actually the claimants challenged that and said that's not tino rangatiratanga. A sliding scale where the Crown holds all the power and all the knowledge is not te tiriti. And the tribunal said, this is the first time we've ever heard anyone challenging a former tribunal decision. Well, that's happening more and more now because the tribunal is part of the Crown. And the tribunal's principles of the treaty are still part of the Crown's jurisprudence. And so that was really important in galvanising some of that work and those coalitions around that particular kaupapa. Likewise around the digital, which we actually won in the tribunal, because it was about who controls mātauranga, who exercises kaitiakitanga, how do you ensure that Māori sovereignty over data, which includes all the knowledge that you're talking about in this kaupapa, that you can't sign away the right to do that in some offshore tribunal. You have to have the space here to have Māori data sovereignty, Māori digital governance and control of that knowledge. But of course there are recommendations, and what does the Crown do? So fast forward to one of the more recent agreements that there was a UK one and an EU one, and this entity known as Ngā Toki Whakarururanga actually came out of the Y2522 Waitangi Tribunal claim. It went to a mediation on the issues of engagement and secrecy. And out of that, the Crown agreed to work with a new entity whose kaupapa would be sourced in he whakaputanga, me te tiriti o Waitangi, and which the Crown agreed it would ensure have meaningful and effective influence over trade policy and negotiations. And so part of the problem, the challenge that we have in Ngā Toki Whakarururanga is what we often call the inside-outside strategies. So on the inside, we're doing all of this terribly tedious technical stuff about proposed texts and agreements, and battling with them when we have the environment chapter, which is unspeakable, and which garbles concepts like Māori. Yeah? Yes, they use it, that's the problem. they throw these concepts in there, and Maui Solomon, who is a key part of ngā Toki Whakarururanga's pūkenga on this, did a moana from back in the early 90s explaining to them again what this was. We didn't get to see the final thing till it's done. And then what do you do? So ngā Toki Whakarururanga does Treaty of Waitangi assessments that critique the agreements against Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the 4 articles, and put those into the arena. Doesn't change necessarily what the Crown does, but it changes it at the edges, but it galvanises more. Similarly, in a new agreement known as the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is led by the US, the trade pillar included agriculture and GMOs. And so we had to sign a secret squirrel pact so that we could see what was actually on the table and argue back with them, and that's what Jessica was talking about the conversation of the deaf. And it still did make a difference, though. It did, in that it stopped the worst part, and I'm looking at the clock here, it stopped the worst part of what could have happened. So let me skip to the worst part, which is because what the US wanted to put forward was what they have agreed to but couldn't get in the TPPA. In the TPPA, the stuff on GMOs is that there are rules that apply to GMOs, but your domestic policy, if it says no GMOs, can survive. Right? The USMCA doesn't allow that. And so there is now a case against Mexico, and Mexico has been fabulous the people of Mexico have been fabulous in fighting many of the battles around GMOs and biotech, right back to the fact that the Zapatista Rebellion was launched on the 1st of January 1994 when the North America Free Trade Agreement came into force. That connection has always been there. 2003 in Cancun Ministerial, there was a great big food sovereignty conference where the people of Chiapas, and there's a picture in one of these flyers we've done held a food sovereignty conference, WTO out of agriculture. There were barriers to protect them in this conference, this WTO ministerial. Farmers from everywhere were talking about WTO kills farmers. Lee Kyung-hai, a Korean farmer, disemboweled himself on the barricades. So the resistances in Mexico and by Mexico are legion. So their government there has now just announced a ban on GM corn being used in tortilla, and an introduction of a ban to happen on all GM corn in all human and animal foods. So the US has now brought a dispute against Mexico under the USMCA, claiming that this breaches Mexico's obligations under the USMCA because it is not based on science and risk assessments as the agreement requires. Now imagine here, when we have now this shift from no GMOs to yes GMOs, which means under the TPPA, and its successor, which is another horrible acronym called the CPTPP, we will move out of the safe zone of no domestic GMO policy, so those rules don't apply, into the zone of potential disputes being brought by other countries here. And we will run the risk of investment disputes by the likes of Bayer and others, who will bring what are known as investor-state disputes against New Zealand in kangaroo courts offshore. And this is what the MAI was all about. And they can bring a dispute, the company against the government, claiming it has impacted on the value of their investment and their profits, which includes their intellectual property rights. And they can sue the government not just for lost investment to date, but lost future profits that they would expect with compound interest running into the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. So imagine a future government here trying to reverse the reversed GMO ban, reinstate it, being threatened by those companies with a dispute and being what we call chilled in not proceeding with that, reinforced by the fact that a so-called transparency provision in these agreements guarantees that foreign companies and foreign states have a right to comment on any proposed new laws or policies that the government might introduce, which includes threatening to bring such disputes. So I hope you've got a bit of a picture there about why these agreements matter. What can we do about it? We can educate ourselves. We can continue raising these issues in submissions and so on, because Parliament doesn't have a clue. But more importantly, we can, in many different ways, resist. What ngā Toki Whakarururanga has done recently is that it has lodged a claim in the tribunal as part of the constitutional kaupapa claim inquiry. And that involves a challenge to the violation of tino rangatiratanga. The principles of the treaty are not te tiriti. Thirdly, the third cause of action is capitalism. And the fourth cause of action is denial of tino rangatiratanga in the international zone, which includes not just a seat at the table, but a right to define what is on the table, and the right of exercise of mana motuhake and tino rangatiratanga in making Indigenous treaties outside the Crown. And that is what Mā Tātua Declaration was about, and it sets a really good model for what might be done in the future. Kia ora.